Welcome everybody. Welcome back to UCREL. We have had a slight break due to the strikes, but now we are back on. And today we are very pleased to be joined by Lancaster's own Gavin Brookes. Me and Gavin have been trying to get this talk off the ground for quite some time. But we've had to reorganise it a couple of times, but I'm very glad to actually be able to welcome you today to UCREL. But I won't delay, I'm going to let you get straight on with your talk.
Okay, thanks, Chloe. Yeah, this has been a long time coming between the two of us, at least. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about some work that I've done on looking at representations of obesity in the news. So I'll just jump straight in. So the talk that I'm going to give today is based on a recently completed project called Representations of Obesity in the News. This was a project in the CAS Centre here at Lancaster. The aim of the project was to examine the language around obesity in contemporary UK print media using methods from corpus linguistics and critical discourse studies. The project ran for 2 years between 2018 and 2020. Paul Baker, who I think is in the audience, yeah, he is. Paul was the principal investigator and I was his research assistant on the project. In the project, we looked at the topic of obesity, the representation of obesity from a range of methodological and also thematic perspectives. And we've covered these in quite comprehensive analysis in a book which came out last year. And I've put the picture of the cover of the book on this slide as a sort of shameless plug. But today I'm going to focus on two aspects of our analysis in particular. So first, I'll look at how obesity is framed by tabloids and broadsheets, so compare those different formats. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to look at the gendered discourses that the press uses to represent men and women with obesity. But first, a bit of context. So obesity is actually is probably a concept that we're all familiar with, but it's actually quite difficult to define. And that's because it has lots of competing definitions, all of which sort of entail different understandings of what obesity actually is, including whether or not it's a medical condition, in fact. The World Health Organization does recognize obesity as a disease, and it defines it as excessive fat accumulation that may impair health by contributing to chronic disease. In the UK, a person can be diagnosed as obese if they have a body mass index or BMI score of 30 or above. In the UK, obesity currently affects around a quarter of adults and about a fifth of children, and these figures are predicted to rise as well, with over half of adults predicted to be obese by the year 2050. Obesity has been associated with a range of health issues, including diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and also some types of cancer. And as such, public health organisations around the world have responded to it in various ways, foremost through campaigns which typically encourage people to consume less sugary and fatty food and drink and to exercise more. The most prominent example of this in the UK is the Change for Life campaign. It's a long-running campaign. I put a poster of that here on this slide, but there's also been fresh campaigns responding to rising obesity rates during the COVID lockdown too. So it's a persistent topic, public health topic. Back to the project. So to investigate how obesity is represented in British newspapers, we assembled a corpus of all UK mainstream newspaper articles which mentioned either obese or obesity over a 10-year period, so between 2008 and 2017. As you can see, this amounts to just under 44,000 articles and around 36 million words, and they're fairly evenly split between tabloids and broadsheets. We collected articles using LexisNexis, and as such, it's worth mentioning that our corpus required a lot of cleanup in terms of removing duplicates and noise, and we had to do that before we could analyse the articles. Okay, so I'm going to go straight into the analysis now. So the first part of the analysis I want to show you today, as I mentioned, compares how the British tabloids and broadsheets frame obesity. And here I'm particularly interested in three areas. So I'll first look at how obesity is defined in the articles, then at what types of things are represented as causing obesity, and then finally, what the tabloids and the broadsheets suggest as appropriate responses or solutions. So to compare the tabloids and the broadsheets against each other, we used the keywords technique. And in this case, we compared all of the articles from the tabloids against all of the articles in the broadsheets and vice versa. So this gave us two sets of keywords, one which showed us the most characteristic words in the tabloids and the other showing the most characteristic words in the broadsheets. We took the top 100 keywords from each list and analysed these qualitatively using concordances, and this allowed us to interpret the keywords in terms of the ways that they defined obesity, framed its causes, and also responses and solutions to it. And we're talking about quite high frequency items here, so keywords that often occur many thousands of times. So this analysis was based on the most frequent patterns in samples of 100 users of each keyword, random samples. We then related prominent obesity representations or frames to wider textual, discursive and social practices. So this included things like the context in which the articles were produced and also consumed. And we also tried to consider on that basis their implications from a public health perspective. Rather than provide you with a big list of keywords that no one will probably be able to read in a slide, what I'm instead going to do is jump straight into the analysis. I'm going to talk about some of the frames we identified and flag up the relevant keywords as I go. So onto the analysis, and the first aspect that I want to consider is how the issue of obesity is defined. Starting with the tabloids, these defined obesity as a biological or medical problem, and we found evidence for this in lots of the tabloid keywords that denoted illnesses and diseases, and I've put these at the top of this slide here. So the tabloids are more likely to use words like condition, disease, and stroke, and these other words too. And the tabloids tended to use these words to label obesity as a disease or a condition, and they did this in lots of different ways. So in the top example from the Express, obesity is referred to straightforwardly as a disease, and it's grouped together with another disease, inflammatory bowel disease, that is. And this type of grouping together of obesity with more established and I'd say less contested diseases happens a lot in the tabloids, and particularly involving diabetes and heart disease, actually. I should also mention at this point that I've highlighted the relevant keywords in red in these extracts. But as well as being constructed as a disease itself, obesity was also framed as being the cause of other diseases. So in the bottom example on this slide, it's type 2 diabetes. But moving on to the broadsheets, rather than being a medical problem, the broadsheets tended to frame obesity as a social issue. And this theme manifests in lots of different keywords, but I'll focus here on the most explicit ones. And I'm going to refer to these I'm going to refer to these as social issues keywords. So these include words like climate, housing, social, and society. The keyword social is used in lots of different senses, mainly to refer to social care. But when it's used to define obesity, we see the recurring phrase social problem in the broadsheets. And as this top example shows, there's often a sense in the broadsheets that the scale of the social problem of obesity is big and growing. The broadsheets also grouped obesity together with other topical social problems like climate change and the UK's housing crisis. And that's why we get keywords like climate and housing in the broadsheets. So in this bottom extract, obesity is listed as one of the biggest issues facing society alongside climate change and the need for renewable energies. Now, if you remember, we previously saw on the last slide how the tabloids grouped obesity with diseases and health problems like diabetes and cancer. So it's interesting to see how the broadsheets instead tend to use this kind of grouping to categorize obesity alongside social problems like climate change. In terms of what causes obesity, the tabloids tended to focus on food and eating, and this was indicated by the tabloid keywords calories, crisps, eating, fat, food and snacks. Most of the time, the tabloids discussed high fat and high sugar food and drink as the causes of obesity, and that's not particularly surprising, and you can see an example of that from the Mirror. The keywords eat and eating also indicate a focus on consumption practices. So readers were often addressed directly and not only told that what they were eating could make them obese, but also that how they ate could make them obese too. So in the second example from the male, readers are addressed directly through the pronoun you and told that eating too quickly will make them fat. As well as what and how people ate, the tabloids also framed the causes of obesity in terms of biological processes. So this discourse was sort of scientific, or at least scientific sounding, or even pseudoscientific. But it was indicated through keywords that suggest a tabloid preoccupation with the body's internal processes. So we get keywords like brain and bacteria, cells, cholesterol, and hormones. So the top example here provides a good illustration of what this kind of discourse looks like, where obesity is framed as resulting from a hormonal defect, which means that the brain receives the message that the stomach is full more slowly than it does in healthy weight people. The second type of discourse around these keywords is a little more extreme, and it's not as common as the first type. But this frames obesity as being caused by an infectious virus that makes fat cells multiply. And these types of claims tend to be made in the context of scientific research, which I think is intended to add some legitimacy to these types of propositions, which might otherwise appear contentious or even sensationalistic. So for the tabloids then, obesity is caused either by individuals eating too much or in the wrong way, or by having some internal biological defect. But the point here is that the causes of obesity are located firmly with or even within the individual, rather than focusing on the wider environmental factors and socio-political factors like the junk food industry, for example. But importantly, the broadsheets did focus on these types of issues. So some of the broadsheet keywords indicated a theme of social inequality. So we get keywords like housing, inequality, and poverty. And as the first two extracts here show, poverty and inequality could be given quite straightforwardly as the causes of obesity in the broadsheets. It's also notable that the first example here quotes the government's public health minister, so a politician, rather than foregrounding the perspectives of scientists and medical practitioners like the tabloids tend to, and I'll come back to that shortly. The other keyword associated with social inequality is housing, and this is an interesting case. So we saw this word mentioned earlier in cases where the broadsheets grouped obesity with other social issues like the housing crisis and climate change. But this word also was also used to index the social inequalities that were associated with obesity. So in this final example taken from The Guardian, we're told that the world's heaviest man lives in a housing association bungalow in Ipswich. So in the UK, housing associations are non-profit organisations which provide low-cost housing for people in need of a home. So by mentioning this here, by foregrounding the fact that this man lives in a housing association bungalow, The Guardian might be implying that this man's likely lower income and potentially working class status is in some way relevant to his obesity. The broadsheets were also more likely to explore the role of industries and big businesses in contributing to rising obesity rates. So the words business, companies, company, corporate, and industry were all key in the broadsheets compared to the tabloids. In most cases, the industries being blamed for causing obesity were food and drink companies and soft drink manufacturers in particular. But as these extracts demonstrate, when the broadsheets talk about these industries, they actually focus more on the role of the government and the government's failure or perceived failure to properly regulate these types of goods and the ways that they're advertised or taxed. At least in the left-leaning press, and I'll come again. That's something I can come back to later. So, having defined obesity and its causes, what do the keywords tell us about who the tabloids and broadsheets think should be dealing with rising rates of obesity and how? Well, beginning with the tabloids, earlier we saw that the types of food that people ate and how they ate were things that were framed by the tabloids as causing obesity. And so it makes sense then that the tabloids also tended to frame individuals eating more healthily as a solution to this. And this was indicated by the tabloid keywords healthy, vitamin, and diet, as well as in some uses of the keywords eat and eating, which were keywords that we looked at earlier. And as these examples show, healthy eating was often packaged alongside exercise as a means for people to manage their risk of obesity. And this message was framed both directly and indirectly as an instruction to readers, as an imploration to them to eat better and to exercise more. And this also extends to looking after others too. So for example, in the second and third extracts on this slide, we see adults responsibilized as parents to ensure that their children exercise and eat healthily. And this kind of discourse actually has quite a strong gender dimension, and that's something that I'll look at in the second half of the talk. Diet and exercise also formed parts of tabloid narratives about individuals, often celebrities, who were once obese but had since reduced their weight through diet and exercise. So we found evidence of these types of weight loss narratives in the use of a wide range of tabloid keywords. So this includes verbs denoting weight loss, so keywords like lose, losing, loss, shed, slim, and slimming, as well as words that denote the measurement and resultant quantification of the body and body fat. So we get keywords like dress size, pound, stone, weighed, weighs, and weight. And broadly speaking, there were two types of tabloid narratives around weight loss. So the first are first-person narratives, such as this top extract here from the Express. And these types of narratives also help to account for why words like I, my, and me, these pronouns are key in the tabloids compared to the broadsheets. However, more frequently, narratives were presented in third person. And an example of this is a narrative around a celebrity named Scarlett Moffat. So Scarlett Moffat came to prominence in the UK as a reality TV star on a show called Gogglebox. I'm sure lots of you have heard of it and probably also watched it. Anyway, a couple of years ago, Scarlett Moffat lost quite a lot of weight, and most of the tabloids and other media picked up on this and reported it in these types of weight loss narratives. And I've picked this example at the bottom of this slide because it contains a few of the keywords relating to this theme, along with some other hallmarks of these types of narratives. So this includes the use of positive evaluative language. So Scarlett's described as flaunting her newly slimline figure. Her weight loss is described as impressive, and her desire to show off the results of her fitness and diet plan is described as understandable. As well as this, she's reported on in the context of attending a party, and this reflects a wider theme across these types of narratives, whereby weight loss is constructed as something which improves individuals' social lives and something that opens up their social worlds. So the people at the centre of these weight loss narratives, like Scarlett Moffat and others, are glorified by the tabloids. They're presented in positive terms, and they're even offered as role models to readers. And this is because we think that this is because they embody the ideal of the good neoliberal citizen. They're the types of people who take it upon themselves to lose weight by exercising and eating more healthily. But diet and exercise weren't the only weight loss practices discussed by the tabloids, and some of the other keywords from the tabloids denoted medical procedures. So we get keywords like bypass, gastric, and surgery. Unlike diet and exercise, though, medical weight loss wasn't evaluated positively in the tabloids or put forward by them as a desirable response to obesity. Broadly speaking, instead, there are two types of stories about medical weight loss procedures in the tabloids. The first are horror stories about gastric band operations gone wrong. So these include cases that result in people actually dying. So you can see an example of that from the Mail at the top of this slide. The second type are stories about how much these medical weight loss operations cost the National Health Service and, by extension, UK taxpayers. So in this second extract on this slide, again from the Mail, this is a story about a man who went on a TV show to talk about how he felt let down because the NHS had refused him a gastric band unless he lost weight first. And the article is quite negative in its evaluation of this man. The headline asks rhetorically, so does someone force a donut down your neck? The article also foregrounds certain aspects of the man's identity which aren't really relevant to the story, but which help to construct him as a financial burden. So he's described as unemployed, and then in the next sentence, we also learn that he's a father of 6. The article also quotes viewers who took to Twitter to call to insult the man and to call him things like a lazy slob, and it does so without presenting any alternative perspective, either from social media or anywhere else. And for us, the reason why surgical responses to obesity appear to be so unpopular with the tabloids is perhaps captured by this extract taken from a position piece published in The Mirror. And this reads, "There's a general feeling among overweight people that they don't have to make a concerted effort to lose weight because they can always fall back on gastric surgery." And perhaps this is it. Maybe people who want to undergo operations to lose weight are demonized by the tabloids because they're perceived to be putting in minimal effort and as expecting taxpayers to pay for them to have their operations. In other words, these people are presented as the very antithesis of the self-regulating neoliberal citizens, like Scarlett Moffat, who we saw earlier, who the tabloids celebrate and build their positive narratives and success stories around. But in contrast to the tabloids, the broadsheets tended to foreground other types of responses to obesity, in particular governmental and political responses. And this is indicated by a raft of keywords, including like Cameron, coalition, conservative, David as in David Cameron, debate, funding, government, investment, Labour, local, minister, party, political, politicians, policy, politics, reform, security, and tax. And this is a staple feature really of broadsheet coverage. They tend to report more on political interest stories than tabloids, so it's not too surprising. But it does nevertheless portray an interesting difference in the types of approaches to obesity that are advocated by these newspapers. But even here, we find a notable distinction between newspapers to the left and right of the political spectrum. So, in other words, how pro and anti government newspapers framed the government's responses to obesity. So the left-leaning anti-government Guardian newspaper suggests that rising obesity rates could be addressed through the introduction of a sugar tax designed to make healthier foods more affordable than unhealthy foods. Now, such a tax was introduced in the UK in 2016 in the form of the soft drinks industry levy. However, prior to the introduction of that tax, the Guardian criticised the government for failing to implement this measure and accused it and the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, of not being hard enough on the junk food industry. On the other hand, the right-leaning, pro-government broadsheets like The Telegraph and The Times seem to be more supportive of Cameron's initial resistance to the sugar tax, and they expressed a sceptical position about how effective such a tax might be. So, for example, in the second extract on this slide, the Telegraph argues that there's no credible evidence that the sugar tax would be effective in reducing obesity rates, and it instead focuses on the adverse impact that such a tax might have on small business owners. And to support this argument, they even quote the head of the National Federation of Retail Newsagents, which is quite indicative about the perspective that they're sympathetic towards. Despite the fact that they clearly hold differing views on the sugar tax, whether they're left or right-leaning, the broadsheets did at least engage in these types of discussions and debates about the role of the government and tax and businesses in the context of obesity, and they did so much more than the tabloids. So in summary, so far at least, the tabloids tend to frame obesity as a medical problem, a disease even, that's caused by by possible biological defects, but certainly by people not practicing effective self-care and lacking discipline with respect to their diet and exercise. From this view, obesity becomes a problem of personal responsibility. So it's individuals who are responsible for making sure that they don't become obese, and if they do, they're responsible for addressing it by making positive health changes in their lives. The broadsheets, on the other hand, characteristically frame obesity as a social issue and one that's caused by what's often referred to as an obesogenic environment. And this is brought about by the failure of governments from that perspective to adequately regulate junk food and sugary drinks industries, as well as to fail to design urban spaces in ways that are more conducive to walking and cycling rather than driving or catching the bus. And the logic of the broadsheets dictates that since obesity is caused by powerful institutions like the government and junk food industries, it's those same powerful institutions that should be responsible for preventing and responding to it. Although, of course, with the left and right-leaning broadsheet distinction, there is some disagreement as to exactly how the government should approach this issue. Now, I have to stress here that the keywords approach shows relative rather than absolute differences. So it's not the case, for example, that the broadsheets don't engage at all in the types of responsibilizing representations that we've seen in the tabloids. It's just that the tabloids do it a lot more than the broadsheets do, to the extent that we see it coming out in the top keywords. But accounting for the differences between the tabloids and the broadsheets can be a little tricky, and we're forced to hypothesize a bit here. But it might be the case that in publishing shorter and more accessible articles, the tabloids provide an overly simplistic view of obesity. Similarly, apportioning blame to individuals might fit better with the more sensationalist style of the tabloids compared to the broadsheets. And as I mentioned, the broadsheets also tend to provide more political commentary generally, not just in relation to obesity. So some of the differences could be related to the differing discursive practices in the ways that tabloids and broadsheets actually create and produce news. But whatever the case may be, the tabloids' promotion of a neoliberal rationality could be problematic when we bear in mind its mainly lower income readership. So research suggests that individualized approaches to addressing health problems tend to be less successful with people from low income backgrounds. And this is because the emphasis on personal behavior often fails to acknowledge that individuals' engagement in risky health related behaviors isn't down just to a lack of awareness, but that it often reflects the constraints of their environments and their circumstances. And these are typically things that they can't actually change or control themselves. So perhaps what we need from the media is an at least more balanced approach, which recognizes that if individuals are responsible for maintaining a healthy weight, their efforts can be greatly helped, but also hindered by the actions of much more powerful institutions like the government and food marketers and manufacturers. Okay, so that's the first part of the analysis I want to talk about. And now for the second half, I'm going to focus on the question, what gendered discourses does the British press use to represent men and women with obesity? And here I'm using the term discourse in a sort of post-structuralist, I suppose Foucault-inspired sense, and follow Jane Sunderland in viewing gendered discourses as those discourses which establish boundaries of social practice through which appropriate gendered behaviour is regulated, and which then provide parameters through which people are represented or expected to behave in particular gendered ways. So in the book, we took a couple of different approaches to analysing gendered discourses and gendered representations in our corpus. But here I want to focus on some analysis that we did of gendered discourses in tabloid weight loss narratives. And you'll recall by tabloid weight loss narratives, I mean articles which report on the weight loss of an individual, but sometimes couples. They are often multimodal, as you can see on this slide. So they often present before and after images, or sometimes just after or result images of people looking slim. These articles can be presented either in first or third person, but in either case, it's important to acknowledge that they're carefully selected and crafted by the editors for newspapers' imagined readerships. So while these articles reflect or are designed to represent the experiences of individuals, they can't be treated as first-hand subjective disclosures or first-hand accounts of weight loss. Oh, it's not letting me navigate forward. Sorry, Chloe, it's not letting me navigate to the next slide for some reason.
That's all right. Would you like to restart your slides? Do you think that would help?
Shall I stop and then come back in with the... Okay. 1 second. Sorry, everybody. I don't know why that's happened. Okay. Okay. Are my slides back on now, at least?
Yeah, the slides are back on now.
Okay, great. I'll try and get to where I was. Sorry about this.
It's okay, it's fine. Like it comes with doing online talks. It's quite the unpredictability of slides. They sort of do what they want.
Okay.
There we go.
Good. Yeah, it seems to be working. Okay, thanks for your patience. Sorry about that. So, okay, so yeah, so for this analysis, we looked at gendered representations and focused on tabloid weight loss narratives. So to do this, we extracted 2 subsamples of articles which presented these types of weight loss narratives, one about men and one about women. To do this, we read through articles from the tabloids in our corpus, taken at random, and extracted the first 100 weight loss stories about women and the first 100 weight loss stories about men that we encountered. I should mention that we managed to find the weight loss stories about women much more quickly than the weight loss stories about men, which I think is itself quite indicative of a sort of gender imbalance in the coverage. Okay, so we looked at the first 100 stories about women and the first 100 stories about men that we encountered, and we took the articles in their entirety. I'd considered searching for certain words or engrams that might indicate narratives, but was concerned that this might shape the results and only give certain types of stories. So instead, we stuck with a more linguistically naive approach. And as you can see, the 2 subsamples are fairly evenly matched in terms of size. So the men's sample of narratives contains just over 100,000 words, and the women's just over 106,000. Once I'd collected the 2 subsamples of weight loss narrative stories, we then generated keywords for each sample by comparing it directly against the other using the parameters on this slide. This gave 68 keywords for the women's narratives and 64 keywords for the men's. We then analysed these qualitatively and critically for representational patterns. And as I've mentioned, I'm particularly interested here in the use of gendered discourses. Okay, so starting with the women's narratives, and the first set of keywords I want to talk about here relate to the theme of motherhood. And I've put all of the relevant keywords here to the left of this slide with their frequencies in brackets. So the keywords indicating this theme of motherhood in the women's narratives include words like mum, pregnant, mother, surrogate, children, kids, pregnancy, and baby. And these words are used in a variety of ways, but 2 patterns are particularly common. So One is a type of story about women whose motivation to lose weight was their desire to have children, like in this top example about the miracle gastric band baby. But most frequently, the motivation for mothers to lose weight was to do better by their children, and for pregnant mothers to do better, pregnant women, sorry, to do better by their unborn babies. This also helps to explain the keenness of the word model in the women's narratives, and this is because this word tends to feature in accounts where mums describe wanting to be a good role model for their children, as in this second extract from the Mail. When the women are represented in these roles and in relation to their children, it's consistently in a position of responsibility, and their weight and consumption practices are constructed as things that have ramifications for their children's health. And while we'd probably expect to find gender-marked words like mother and mum as key in the women's narratives compared to the men's, the marked use of words like children and kids in the women's narratives compared to the men's is perhaps less obvious and indicates a positioning of women as the primary caregivers in families. So in many ways, these patterns provide evidence of women being being placed again in this position of responsibility for children more than men. Other family keywords that we encounter, that we find in the women's narratives, are to do with relationships. So we get words like wedding, husband, and boyfriend. The top keyword here, wedding, recurs in stories about women who want to lose weight for their wedding, or more precisely to fit into their wedding dresses. And these stories have a familiar feel and recall what Sunderland describes as a fantasy discourse around weddings. So in this example, Claire is reported as losing weight to fit into her dream wedding dress and describes feeling like a princess on her wedding day. Oh, sorry, can you just make sure that your mics are muted, please? I think I just got some typing. It was quite loud. Thank you. The other keywords on this slide, so words denoting boyfriends and husbands, could also feature in these narratives, and these male actors were portrayed positively in the main, and they were constructed as being supportive of about their partner's size and also about their weight loss. But sometimes the encouragement betrayed a more problematic element and a concern with appearance. So in this bottom example, Scarlett's boyfriend is described as comparing her to an iPhone with regular updates. And I won't go into why this is problematic, but the wider point here is that the motivations for women's weight loss that we've seen so far are all relational. They say as much about other people, including children and spouses, as they do about the women themselves. Added to this, narratives about weddings exhibit a concern with appearance and tend to focus on fitting into a dream wedding dress, again about how they're perceived by others. And other keywords from the women's narratives indicate a more explicit focus on appearance, and I've called these aesthetic keywords. So the top keyword here, bikini, performs in a similar way to wedding dress that we saw in the previous slide, with the desire to wear a bikini acting as a motivation to lose weight. And then images of the women wearing their bikinis were frequently offered as signals that they had lost weight and gained confidence. So these types of images would be reproduced in the articles. Other keywords in this category provide positive evaluations of appearance. So we get keywords like stunning, beautiful, and amazing. Another keyword that indicates a focus on physical appearance is look, and I've provided an example containing a couple of its uses here. And this could be used to talk about for women to express feeling good about how they look, but also as a command from the voice of the article to implore readers to look at somebody's new appearance, at having lost weight. So the focus on the aesthetic can function as a motivation for women to lose weight in the narratives, but also to orient readers to the results of the weight loss, which are conceptualized in terms of the resulting physical appearance and physical attractiveness. However, this isn't to say that the motivations and results of weight loss in these narratives were just skin deep, as the women's narratives also gave a number of keywords which indicated the disclosure of emotions and emotional states too. So this includes keywords like felt and embarrassed. And these heightened levels of self-disclosure also help to account for a marked use of first-person forms like I, my, me, and the reflexive myself, which were all key in the women's stories compared to the men's. In the majority of cases, the feelings being described were negative, so feelings like embarrassment, shame, and lack of confidence, as in this top example taken from an article about a teacher who was being bullied by children in her school because of her weight. The verb felt was also used to convey more complex emotional states, so loneliness, for example, as in this second example where a woman's loneliness is connected to her weight gain. And this was, again, calling back to something that I mentioned earlier, where weight loss is framed as something which opens up people's social worlds. But it wasn't all negative, as some of the narratives also describe more positive emotional states following weight loss. So in this bottom example, the woman describes feeling and looking great and fantastic, and feeling much more confident in her body after she lost 7 stone. Related to emotional disclosure, the women's narratives also express difficulties surrounding the weight loss process itself. So the keyword tried tends to be used to describe multiple, often failed attempts to lose weight, and this frequently takes the form of lists of the various diets and weight loss plans that the women have attempted. So the woman in the top example describes trying a bunch of Weight Watchers, the Curves plan, keto, and switching from to paleo and dairy-free, all in attempts to lose weight. The keyword desperate tends to be used to describe how desperate the women are to lose weight, and this is used either again to describe multiple attempts, like in the top extract, but also, and less frequently, to set up a description of eating disorders or other disorder practices. So this bottom extract is from a narrative about a woman who lost weight by abusing laxatives. Moving on now to the men's narratives, and these keywords are characterized by an abundance of terms that denote death and disease. So this includes words like cancer, death, risk, and feared, and lots of others that I've put on the left of this slide. And these words emerge as key because where in the women's narratives, weight loss was motivated by things like their responsibility to family, emotional distress, and a desire to look slimmer. For the men, weight loss tended to be triggered by health risks, particularly those that were identified by doctors. So this top example contains illustrations of a few of these keywords, and it tells a story about a man who was rushed to hospital. He was diagnosed with diabetes and was at risk of coma. And this event serves as a turning point for this man to change his lifestyle and to lose weight. These types of stories, these types of articles also bear some of the hallmarks of the types of danger of death narratives described by Labov. And it's literally the threat of death here that makes this man decide to address his body weight. Because we don't see these danger of death narratives in the articles about women, it could be that they're linked to a kind of stoic, even heroic masculinity. In the second example, Britain's fattest man is warned by doctors to lose weight or die, which also helps to legitimize his reasons for losing weight, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But the point here is that men's weight loss is frequently framed as being motivated by health concerns and as occurring in extreme circumstances, particularly when the men in question are faced with the prospect of death. Notably, despite the description of life-threatening events, these narratives are also relatively devoid of emotional disclosure, at least compared to the women's narratives. The men don't describe being fearful, for example. Instead, emotion seems to be replaced with scientific reason. Their decisions to lose weight are not stimulated by their fears or even necessarily concern about or responsibility towards their families, but instead they're based on logic and reason and on advice from medical practitioners. This isn't to say, though, that relatives weren't mentioned in the men's narratives at all, as we do see the keyword wife in the men's data. And this word was used in ways that again position the women in the traditional gendered role of family caregiver, including when it comes to preparing meals. So in this top example, a man attributes his weight loss to the fact that his mum used to cook his meals for him, but then he moved in with his wife and she didn't, so he was left to fend for himself. Then the other two examples on this slide illustrate a kind of secret eater type of story. And this could even be a discourse in itself, where men describe eating meals behind their wives' backs or secretly having extra meals in addition to the ones that their wives have prepared for them. But the point here is that the women are positioned again as the arbiters of health in the family. They're the ones who prepare meals and ensure that those meals are healthy. And so they're the ones who the men have to hide their misdemeanors and unhealthy habits from. And I also want to give an honourable mention here to a less frequent type of story in which wives are described as being jealous of other women looking at at their husbands in supermarkets and things like that after the men had lost weight. And this keys into a sort of bunny boiler style discourse where the women are framed as possessive and the men as irresistible. But as I mentioned, this was a less frequent type of story. Another keyword for the men, and one that surprised us a bit, was the word diet. And this word was used in all kinds of ways, with no clear majority trend overall. But one theme was that the men didn't diet. So in around a fifth of cases, men described what they did as not being diets. It was accompanied by some form of mitigation or straightforward negation, like in this top example, where a man distinguishes between dieting and eating healthily. If the men did engage in diets, they were typically described as being unusual or extreme in some way, and often involving eating lots of meat. So in other words, the men either don't diet at all, or if they do diet, then their diets are framed as being non-conventional, as involving eating lots of meat, high-fat food, and often beer. And this avoidance of using diet in the conventional sense also manifests in the keyword experiment, where men's unusual diets were described as their experiments, like in this bottom example on this slide. By describing weight loss practices as experiments, the men's practices are not only distant from dieting, which might be perceived as feminine, but they're also framed as a kind of scientific quest for knowledge. But meat wasn't the only thing that the men's diets or experiments preserved, and the final set of men's keywords I want to consider here relate to the theme of alcohol and drinking. So this includes the keywords alcohol, beer, drink, and drinking. These latter keywords were also used to refer to soft and sugary drinks too, and these were always portrayed negatively as causing obesity and as being bad for health, so soft drinks, that is. And this is consistent with wider patterns we've seen in the corpus as a whole. However, the coverage of alcohol is much more complex, so I presented the findings from this bit of the analysis in a table, and this shows the 5 most frequent ways in which alcohol was represented in the men's narratives. And overall, this representation was actually quite positive. So most commonly, the articles talked about alcohol's health benefits, and that was in just over a quarter of users. However, it wasn't all positive, and around 21% of cases discussed alcohol's adverse health consequences or presented it as a cause of weight gain. So the narratives also presented alcohol as something that should be stopped completely, but this was the case in just 6% of its users, and the articles were actually much more likely to advise limiting consumption or restricting it to certain conditions rather than stopping drinking alcohol altogether. On the one hand, it could be argued that this is a more realistic way of instigating behaviour change, to encourage smaller and more achievable modifications to behaviour rather than a complete overhaul. However, when we consider that all of the mentions of soft drinks were negative and that the articles consistently encouraged readers to stop drinking soft drinks altogether, it seems to me that something different's happening with alcohol, where the newspapers seem particularly reluctant to present it in a completely bad light. But why are the tabloid narratives so reluctant to tell men to stop eating meat and to stop drinking beer? Well, we think it has something to do with our gendered perceptions of food, and research can back this up. So this graph here is adapted from a study where participants were given a list of food items and asked to indicate whether or not they thought each food item was masculine. This bar chart shows the percentage of respondents who said that they thought each food item was masculine, and I've ordered this to show the foods that were rated as most masculine on the left. And the most masculine foods are dominated by meats. Beef, steak, venison, and lamb are all in the top 5, beaten only by beer. Then the fish items, so we get tuna, fish, shrimp, are all lower down, so they're more feminine, along with fruit, green vegetables, barley, wheat, and things like that. Most worryingly for me is that chocolate is at the bottom, which suggests that I probably need to reevaluate my own masculinity. And this is kind of fun, but the point here is that news coverage of obesity can be seen as reflecting, but perhaps also reinforcing these gendered norms around food and eating. Okay, so in conclusion, weight loss narratives in the tabloids recycle prominent and long-standing discourses around femininity and masculinity. Stories about women who lose weight frame their weight loss as a means for them to perform their role as primary caregiver in the family, as well as aspiring to a slender, ideal feminine body type. The women's accounts were also characterized by emotional disclosure, with weight loss serving as a sort of cathartic function to help the women overcome feelings of embarrassment and shame and to gain confidence. The men's stories, on the other hand, bore many of the hallmarks of hegemonic masculinity. So emotional disclosure was replaced by logic and reason, and weight loss took place to prevent death and disease, particularly following medical advice. Some of the articles also resembled danger of death narratives, with the men portrayed as heroic. Although the articles about men talked about diets more than those about women, the diets that the men engaged in weren't really diets at all, for instance being framed as experiments instead. The men's reported weight loss regimes also helped to maintain some of the staples of masculine diets, including eating lots of food, especially meat, and drinking lots of beer. Now, it's important to bear in mind, as I mentioned earlier, that these aren't faithful accounts of weight loss, but they're highly edited media texts that have been carefully constructed with particular target or imagined readerships in mind. And this might be why the newspapers rely on traditional, quite old-fashioned gendered stereotypes, like the emotional woman and the stoic and rational man, perhaps because they perceive these to be more consonant with their perhaps older perceived readerships. But of course, as well as reflecting society, media texts also have the potential to shape and dictate social norms. And from a public health perspective, these kinds of gender norms haven't done women's or men's health much good in the past. For women, intense focus on slenderness has been linked to the development of weight-related anxieties and eating disorders. Meanwhile, for men, over-reliance on hegemonic masculinity and the norms associated with that could promote the idea that they're invulnerable, emotionally detached, and should only address their health concerns when they are at risk of serious illness or even death. This is a particular concern for men, as men tend to present with symptoms for serious illness much later than women, and in many cases this reduces their chance of recovery. And I'd argue that the public would therefore be better served by coverage which either challenges harmful gendered discourses or which at least incorporates a wider range of gendered identities, rather than relying on a narrow range of very rigid, traditional and heteronormative assumptions about gender roles. Not all men are beer swillers, and not all women are the primary caregivers in families and base their health decisions around their families or their ability to squeeze in a wedding dress or a bikini. And on that note, I can stop. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just going to stop the recording now. Okay.